Thank you everybody for attending Dylan Moore's PhD defense, both in person and to everybody online, all the Zoom people. You can hear us okay, see the slides okay? Yes?
Yes.
Excellent. I'll keep my opening remarks brief since I know Dylan has a lot of interesting stuff to share with us. And so every minute
meeting is being recorded.
As we mentioned, we'll run kind of about 40 to 45 minutes with Dylan presenting. Feel free to ask questions during the presentation. Feel free to field questions if you want, if you really feel like you're going off track. You can request to save them till the end. Then we'll have time for questions from the audience, and then we'll move into the private session with just Dylan and the committee. Okay. So I did just want to mention, because it is customary to make a few remarks about the candidate. I was realizing this morning that Dylan and I have known each other for nearly a decade.
Wow.
Not only have I been Dylan's PhD advisor for the last 5 years, but we first got to know each other back when Dylan was completing his bachelor's degree and his master's in computer science at Stanford. And it's just been so much fun to work together over all those years, follow you into industry at Lark Health and then YouTube, and just to experience the creative spirit that is Dylan. So I'm glad to get the chance to share all your exciting news.
Thank you very much, Liz. And I was very excited to come follow Liz out here when she started her professorship. When I knew I wanted to do a PhD, I was like, there's no one I'd rather work with more than Liz.
Yeah, and really helped found the lab. So it's always bittersweet. They like the but more sweet. Yes. So okay, well, it is your show, Dylan.
We'll see you.
Away.
All right. Well, I have more thank yous at the end, but I just want to first of all appreciate the time that everyone's taking to be here. My family, my friends, my wife, my lab mates, of course the committee. Lori, Petra, Liz, James. I really appreciate it. Let's jump into this work. So I'm going to be talking today about augmenting sense-making in dementia care and education through AI-enabled narrative stewardship. And I'm throwing up some terms here that might not be familiar to everyone, and that's okay. We're going to go through the terminology in a moment. But because a lot of this work is about storytelling and the power of storytelling in care and education, before I get into the details, I just want to tell a story that came out of some of our field work, and I think it'll motivate everything that follows. So this is a caregiver story. All the names here are changed. I pulled them from the cast list of the notebook. So if you recognize them, that's where they're from. But the actual story content itself is information that came out of our field work. So this is the story of Martha and Allie. So Martha is a caregiver at one of the care facilities.
To move.
Do you want to move?
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Is this still capturing me?
Oh,
Yeah,
maybe on that. Yeah, on the
Okay.
other side.
Just want to make sure everyone's seeing. There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, please stop me if something's not quite aligned. But this is the story of Martha. And so Martha is a caregiver who is really everything you would want in a caregiver. She's compassionate and she is interested in people, and she really finds this her mission in life to help support people. And Allie is a care recipient with dementia at a care facility with many care recipients. So on the order of 200 to 300 people. And when Martha enters into the room and sees Allie, she hears something and she walks in and she notices signs of visible agitation, confusion, and refusal to eat. She's been given food, but she's not eating. And she knows if she were able to access the care records, which is often not possible, that Allie actually has a history of being diagnosed with a number of different things, including depression, and she is frequently given antipsychotic medications to sedate her. And she has a history, according to the care records, of being violent. And so the question here is, what should Martha do in this situation? And let's look really closely at the information that's available to her. So she doesn't know very much, and her time and attention are limited. And any action she takes may have legal risks or safety ramifications for her or for the care recipient. And the important thing here is help is probably not on the way. She has to do something. She has a lot of other commitments, so she has to do something fast. And this is a situation that she has to make sense of. And so her options really are, she can choose to medicate this person, to sedate them. This is often something that happens. She can isolate them, or she can choose any number of different redirection strategies. And these are strategies that don't involve medication. And for instance, she could intervene with a particular stimuli to distract or redirect or otherwise de-escalate the situation. But the key here is if she chooses the wrong stimuli, she'll have an adverse reaction in the care recipient. And if she chooses the right one, it may be correct. And so the reality here is that a lot of times people do the wrong things. And this is something I heard from the director of aging, where people enter into a situation and think that what they need to do, in this particular example, was give a hug to a care recipient. But in fact, for that particular recipient, in that particular context, it was inappropriate and would cause them to hit the caregiver. And this is why, for instance, Martha may have had a history of violence, is because actually she was just being inappropriately treated, and that was causing her to be labeled as a violent person, which had all these adverse side effects and long-term consequences. And so the thing is, having the wrong intervention can have all these negative effects, and just medicating people endlessly also is not desirable for obvious reasons. And so my work really looks at, what if we had a fourth option here? What if we add an option to get more context so we can make better sense of what the right thing to do is and take a non-pharmacological intervention that is actually more appropriate for the care recipient's needs and the context as a whole. So I brought in this example of Harry, who is another caregiver, and Harry knows more about our particular care recipient, and he's talked to the family and he knows her background. And so Harry is able to articulate an actionable piece of advice if Martha were able to ask him in this hypothetical situation. And this is, some foods bring back memories of Allie's abusive ex-husband. She might be refusing to eat because she thinks he's nearby. And she loves the Golden Girls, which is something we heard from one of our care recipients. Rose is her favorite character. You don't need to medicate her, just redirect her by talking to her about her TV show and telling her her family members are on their way. And so the key here is Harry has not only expertise, he knows how to give care, but more importantly, he has context about who this person is. And so my work is going to look at this question of the staff could use several Harrys, but where are they? Why don't these people exist? Why isn't this happening? And moreover, how might we scale Harry into more than just this particular use case? Because as we'll see as we go through the examples here in my work, this is not the only case where this type of person-centered support is actually important. And so with that, I'm going to dive into some background work to just set the stage for what's already happened in the literature and give some more context to the different terms that I've thrown out there in the beginning. So I want to start by taking a first pass at the obvious place we'd look to support this kind of sense-making. So technology has changed so much in the last couple of years. We have large language models and new perceptive capabilities through computer vision and agentic capabilities that taken together really can augment humans' ability to make sense of new information and take action on their behalfs, and also support their ability just in the real world to provide this type of care and other types of sense-making. And so this type of thing that we're talking about, which is make sense of information, is in the literature defined as sense-making. And I'm going to go into more detail about what this means, and I have a really particular metaphor that I like that's a follow-up work to this that we're going to look at. But systems like this should be able to augment people's sense-making capabilities. So the question we'll look at is, why aren't they in these particular contexts being used, and how can we solve that? And so to really get into what sense-making involves, I have a somewhat long quote that I think is important to read because it ties together the idea of sense-making and narrative. And it captures this notion of how sense-making is a process of really capturing what's going on in a story that creates a sense of plausibility and coherence. So I'll read this quote. If accuracy is nice but not necessary in sense-making, then what is necessary? The answer is something that preserves plausibility and coherence, something that is reasonable and memorable, something that embodies past experiences and expectations, something that resonates with other people, something that can be constructed retrospectively but can also be used prospectively, something that captures both feelings and thoughts, something that allows for embellishment to fit current oddities, something that is fun to construct. In short, what is necessary for sense-making is a good story. And so I use this throughout my work as my definition of what a narrative is. And it's very much, this terminology changes depending on the literature you look at, but I think this is a very useful way to think about that in the terms of sense-making. And this idea of making sense of new information through stories is not new. This has been happening in the human-computer interaction literature for a long time. I only have a limited time here, so I'm going to throw up a couple examples. This particular example I like, Storywell, looks at supporting activity, like physical activity through storytelling. And then Griffin's work, also involving Liz and James, looks at teaching coding through storytelling interfaces. And both of these get at this idea of driving engagement. But I think the example I want to focus on in a little bit more depth is this idea of narrative scaffolding. And this was a paper that just came out. It was actually released in December of this year. And the idea is that they're taking a very literal interpretation of what sense making is, and how might you develop interfaces that support narrative-based iterations around in the service of sense making for a data analysis problem. And so what this quite literally involved is an analyst would write up stories that describe what's happening in these various visualizations that capture data sets and try to explain to themselves what's happening, and then through version control, iterate and refine these narratives. And the important thing here is that this is like the most literal explanation of how sense making can be applied in an HCI domain, but it also involves a lot of manual work. The person who is the analyst has to be directly providing all this context and iterating on it. And while this is useful to show the power of this, it's also really not applicable to our example we talked about earlier, where we have a busy caregiver in a chaotic situation. So I think we have to step back and say, well, what really is sense making about? Like, what is missing from that equation? And I like this, this metaphor that Dervin introduced of the chasm, they call it the gap, and then the idea about sense making is you're trying to bridge this gap. And so in Dervin's sort of follow-up work on the idea of sense making, they describe the gap as the questions, confusions, anxieties that a user has about a problem. And so, for instance, it's when our caregiver enters the room and they're filled with questions and concerns and they don't know what to do. How do they make sense of this information? But just as important in this metaphor is the idea that the user here has a history, an experience, and a current horizon, or like a frame of reference that has some failing understanding. There's something that isn't working for them. And these two things together form the context that help us as someone observing this sense-making problem understand what's going on in the gap. And if you were to not have that context, it's just difficult to make sense of what's going on with that anxiety, that confusion, or even how to think about it, because they're isolated, they're decontextualized. And so—
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So you introduce the gap as
Yeah.
if it's the caregiver has this gap, but then when you say user, is that then the patient in this case, the way you describe it, or is it the
Yeah.
caregiver?
That's a good question. For pretty much all intensive purposes for this particular talk, the user is the caregiver.
Okay.
Or the family member later we'll see could become the user.
Okay.
Yeah, because the user is we're trying to support the sense making of the caregiver, and the care recipient is unable to provide context, and they really need support, and the caregiver just doesn't know how to approach that because they don't understand their life experience.
Great, thanks.
So it's the life experience of the care person receiving care.
Exactly.
Because also the life experience of the caregiver might be quite
Yeah.
important in this context.
That's right. And so I think in this example, when I say that the history and experience of the user, that's basically the experience that the caregiver has working with this person, or their knowledge of what that person's experience is. And so we can't understand this gap until we have enough context. And actually, as you've mentioned, there's a couple different users involved in here. And one of the things that my work examines is how these systems are often designed for a single user and a single system, but that's not really the dynamic that's happening in practice. We have many users who have fragmented understandings of a problem, and collecting those different shards of context into a coherent narrative is the task that I'm looking at here.
12 minutes.
Okay, just to sort of wrap up on this, the idea of sense making is that we're constructing this analogy, these bridges. And the bridges are really stories that have emotional or sort of other types of content in them that allow the particular person who's doing the sense making to develop a new understanding and sort of change their current horizon, or dismantle old understandings that were ineffective. So basically change the way they make sense of the world, which is captured through a story. or a narrative, and then do that with the help of these bridges. So over the course of, I'm going to focus from here on out basically on the case studies and then tie it together at the end. And there's 3 case studies we're going to look at, and each one introduces a technical artifact that instantiates a novel approach. So as we said earlier about sort of tying together the sort of fragmented context that individuals have in these sense-making situations, and then providing support based on that, and then empirical findings from field work and deployment studies where we tested these artifacts in the wild, and then a sensitizing lens for future designers. This is just like a design orientation that we can throw out there that can generalize beyond the particular case studies we looked at. So specifically, the 3 studies we're going to look at, the first one is called Care Insights. It was published in IMWIT of last year. The next one is Family in the Loop. It's an extension. It looks at sort of this dementia care problem, but zooms out to include family members. And then the third one is looking at the use case of education, and we'll talk about that one last. And it adds some variants here so we can see how, for a very different use case, but with a similar type of missing context problem, how this can generalize. So first I want to talk about Care Insights. So to understand why we're even talking about this, I think it's worth mentioning that this is a huge problem. There are 7 million Americans today with dementia, and in fact, that amounts basically to 1 in 9 people 65 or older. So this is a very big and important population, and as the US population and the global population ages, this is going to become an even larger population. Estimates are that it's going to reach about 13 million by 2050. So at the moment, there's a crisis in care facilities because even before COVID-19, there was a shortage of caregivers, and even with more caregivers, there's a lot that you need to provide effective care here. But with the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a 14% reduction in workforce, and that's just never recovered. And so this is meaningful because when we talk about what good care is, what's involved in good care for dementia, we really are talking about person-centered care. It's kind of the uniformly agreed on gold standard here. And that involves knowing the unique individual through an interpersonal relationship. It involves understanding what things you can leverage about their personal experiences and memories, like did they play guitar, what books do they like, did they like the Golden Girls, to bring back those memories, de-escalate situations, and just overall improve the quality of life of an individual. And unfortunately, most care practices still adopt a medicalized approach in which physical needs are prioritized over psychosocial well-being. And this is where people are not necessarily being seen as these complex individuals with lots of unique experiences, but in fact, just treated as their condition. And this is especially problematic when we have one caregiver managing many different care recipients in a chaotic manner. And you just start seeing a situation where people aren't being recognized as who they are. And that has implications in terms of over-medication and bad outcomes. So my work looks at how can we bring back and restore that sort of full context when it's needed without overburdening the caregivers in the process. And that's a very delicate balance. And so specifically, the research question for this particular project was, how might we design AI-enabled technology that captures the latent context? And I'm calling it latent context here because it's there. Like, this is information that's being discussed between caregivers, but it's oftentimes just not present in the moment when it's really needed to enable person-centered care in resource-constrained facilities. And so I think it's worth noting, like, why don't we just use ChatGPT? Like, people are using ChatGPT for everything. So I took this example of Martha and like the different information we had, and I passed it into ChatGPT. And the result you get is that refusal to eat could be depression or delirium or swallowing issues or medication side effects, all of which the caregiver would already know. And that you should have a calm tone, slow pacing, and just basically say, I'm here to help, let's sit down. And this is not only impersonal, overly general, and not actionable, it's also condescending if you give this type of feedback to a caregiver who has experience but just doesn't know how to deal with this particular individual. So the real thing here is that context is missing, and we have to bring it back. We have to restore it. And the way this happens in care facilities is caregivers will leverage each other. So we look at how we might do that. So this study involved 7 care facilities, an extended period of need-finding field work where we just were learning about what was actually happening. And then in the end, 33 care recipients involved in a deployment study. And I think what's important to just mention here is that this type of work is slow. IRB approval is slow, and getting the trust of the care facilities to work with you is slow, and it's very easy to break that trust. And it's important when you're doing this type of work that you don't do more harm than good. And so it's not really the focus of this, but if you take a look at my papers, I talk a lot more about sort of the different sensitive considerations you should be having when you do this type of work. So I partnered with a team of experts, Memcara. They're memory loss care experts, and they're awesome, and I think they're on this call. And what I really like about their program is they have a visual aid, which has videos and pictures and music, and they're really focused on music-based therapy. And this tablet program, they'll give a tablet to care recipients or set it up if they can't hold it, and then they'll have the stimuli cycling through there on the tablet with different sort of choreographed programs to augment care, and then they'll stand there and support care in person. And the cool thing about this is that it presents a unique opportunity for data capture that isn't available in general, which is we have a camera with a very uniform view of the care recipient's face. And so we don't have to worry about whether they're going to be looking or not. We know that the person's going to be focused, and if they're not, we know that's generally low attention. And so I'll talk about why that's important in a moment. But the focus in this work was we leveraged the particular intervention of music-based therapy because it's been shown to be highly effective. It's uniquely effective in dementia care. Music sort of it lights up different parts of the brain, and it's especially effective if you have an individualized understanding and goals. So if you know something about a person and what memories you're trying to trigger, then you can better get at that with music. And if you don't, then it is kind of not as effective. So after sort of observing the caregivers, we focused on developing a system that starts with the idea of capturing these meaningful behavioral moments. And so what are meaningful moments? And this was an idea that came directly from what caregivers said, where here there's a memory on the bottom right that's being described by a care recipient during one of the recordings we made. And the memory is basically of her with her grandson at an apple orchard. And on the annotated transcripts that you see on the side, we have different dimensions of engagement. So attention to the conversation, behavioral disturbances, reactions, and all of this sort of way of looking at the problem, it very much aligns with the NIH Music Toolkit, but it also came directly from caregivers. And I just want to point out that there's basically 2 levels of thinking about what a meaningful moment is. There's the actual sort of story, which is, oh, someone told the story to me. And then there's, well, what behaviors sort of, if you annotated a transcript and highlighted sort of, how much does this behavior light up or not, what behaviors correspond to those meaningful moments? Because that's how a caregiver sees these situations. So we tried to look at the problem through the lens of what caregivers are already doing to do a better job of both making a system that has visibility and also capturing existing practices. So this was our method for understanding caregiver sense making. We developed a unique tool to annotate data. We captured 203 about 20-minute sessions. They're longer or shorter depending on what happens in the sessions. We gathered mind maps, notes, field works, just a bunch of data, synthesized it to generate this understanding of what a story looks like that comes out of this, and that's these meaningful moments, and how you get to that. So what sort of logical rules a caregiver might do in situ to come up with that story. And after that, we looked at sort of what context enrichment might happen behind the scenes. So a caregiver isn't usually coming in totally empty to these situations. They have some knowledge from the health records of who they're working with. And so how can we integrate with those systems and pull that information in? The system we looked at here is point-click care. It's used by the majority of care facilities. And it's really focused on compliance, billing, and tracking of medications. And so it's not a great fit for what we're talking about here, which is the stories that convey all this rich nuance and interpersonal dynamics. But it is what's being used, and it is where data lives in care facilities. So it's important to integrate with it and enrich your stories with this information. And one thing that we heard, we talked about, why doesn't this work, is that point-click care doesn't advocate for care recipients. That's what we heard from family members. like in the way that a family member might sit, if they were sitting in on the interaction, just say, oh, this is what they mean. Be an advocate for what their context is. These records sit somewhere on an isolated terminal that is hard to get to, it's not in the room, and they just aren't there in the moment providing context-relevant support. And so the next thing is synthesize. So once we have this story bank of data, and I'll show you in a moment what that looks like in our system, then how do we synthesize from the insights we've gathered to respond to new queries for support? So for instance, if a caregiver walks in and they ask a very specific question or a more general question, like what helps calm this resident, how can we provide a plausible narrative account like we saw earlier with Harry, that story? How can we provide that type of support, be an AI Harry? Basically, we heard again that just any tool that caregivers can use to get a break, because they have, on top of all their normal duties, at the end of the day, they do note-taking, and they hate it, and they don't remember what happened during the day because they've been so burdened. So anything that can relieve those note-taking duties, and any tool that can provide real-time responsiveness without overburdening them in the moment is super important. You just can't, you can't tread on those cognitive constraints from someone who's already so burned out. And so that's the important part of guiding the care in situ. How can we tailor to support a caregiver's needs and understand their constraints? And finally, all of this can be in service of exploring new ways to capture new information. So if we can provoke moments that are meaningful that we've never seen before, then we can go beyond just repeating the same types of interactions and actually explore the space of what's possible for a care recipient. And so these different stages, the first 3 of them became APIs. So an API for information capture, you just plug in your video stream to it and it captures that and turns it into stories that gets captured in this care records layer. Context enrichment, same thing, plugs in, it's capturing real-time data. And synthesis is an API that provides support for queries that come in. And I guess one last thing I'll say on this, the guidance happens. So we have these terminals that Memcara has already in care facilities. We're able to provide guidance right on top of that, either on the tablet that's being used or in a different device. So they can do what they're already doing and just see this right on top of that as a widget. I think I'll come back to the technical implementation for more detail if there's questions, just to get to the rest of the content. But what I want to highlight here is we used a stacked approach where we capture intermediate features using existing off-the-shelf models. We use DeepFace, MetaPipe, and a sliding window. And then we look for these moments of change point detection. So when these different intermediary features, reactions, emotions, symptoms, and memory, when there's a change in those, we're able to recognize where those changes are and have rules that correspond to each change. So for instance, if engagement goes from low to high and there's a positive change in emotion, bless you, then we know that that positive change in emotion alongside that change in engagement, alongside the stimuli that we're getting as sort of a record of on-screen events, all means something. And we can say that's probably a positive redirection event. And then we can we can gather story information using transcription. Our synthesis is basically a RAG type architecture, retrieval augmented generation, where we have this database of stories that we've gathered, and then we're using that through RAG to generate responses to queries. And importantly, we're including citations back, and we have a process for vetting that these citations are actually accurate so that there's inspectability within the system. And just to talk a little bit about the evaluation we do here. So we had comparable results to human experts. These are the caregivers in our F1 scores here. And this is for looking at the performance metrics. There's the different levels, right? So we have the engagement factors. We're looking at, for a video, can we generate attention, reaction, symptoms, all these different sort of per second level indicators. And then can we go from those to stories? So we had 2 types of evaluations. We're able to compare against our classification labels for those first types of engagement labels and do quite well. And part of the reason we do so well here, I just want to call out, is that we have the information coming from the caregivers themselves. So for instance, during care, if something happens that's going well, the caregiver will usually call it out, because I was surprised by these numbers. I mean, how can we know? Like, how is this so well? And because they're calling out what's happening, like, oh, it looks like you're responding well to this, or your symptom is reducing, that actually feeds into our system and gives us pretty good results. And then in terms of the story evaluations, we evaluated these by giving them to caregivers and asking them to evaluate the utility, the completeness, and the accuracy. And these metrics come from related works that do similar things. And finally, we had 1,405 unique requests that were sort of responded to by our system. And so we asked caregivers to retroactively evaluate these and say, so how well did this do? Like, what was the utility, completeness, and accuracy of this synthesis response, like providing feedback in a new situation. And overwhelmingly, these caregivers appreciated this. And in the examples where it wasn't working well, we could point to many cases there was recording problems, like audio wasn't getting recorded, or the camera wasn't pointing at the right place. And these are the types of problems that have typically plagued these systems before, where embedding new technology in care facilities is just really difficult, even if you're leveraging existing tools that are already there. And finally, perhaps the most important, we looked at the NASA Task Load Index, and this is a tool that's typically used, an instrument that's used to evaluate the burden along a number of different dimensions, and basically saw no statistical significant difference between our tool and existing techniques. And this is not that surprising because our tool was optional to use. If caregivers didn't want it, they didn't have to use it. It popped up and they could ignore it. And they didn't have to carry around a new device, and they didn't have to do anything different. It was there if they wanted it. It was that option 4 I talked about, just available. And all of this work, I think, was focused on this idea that caregivers are working with one another, and they have this context, and it's just not being synthesized and leveraged effectively. But in fact, over and over again, we were finding that the most important context was something that wasn't in the care facility, it was something the families had. The families know their loved ones best, and the families were often left out of the loop. And so there's this problem where families receive limited updates and just have low transparency into what's happening. And so they have skepticism and often antagonism towards these facilities. And they're concerned that their loved ones aren't being treated well, and sometimes they aren't. And that hinders the willingness of staff to share updates, actually, because they're worried about legal liabilities. So there's this negative feedback cycle that's happening. And one care recipient's family said, I want to feel confident that my loved one's care respects her needs, preferences, even when I'm not there. This was the common feeling we heard in our interviews. And on the other side, when information sharing does happen, it can create this positive feedback loop, where, for instance, one caregiver took it upon themselves to contact family members and call them and say, hey, like, I just want to let you know your loved one who has advanced dementia was singing the other day. They just started mouthing the words and singing along, and it wasn't something that anyone knew they could do. And the family members were so happy. And these moments are really powerful for family members who are in a difficult situation because they want to know that care is happening. And from an incentive structure perspective, if you don't have this information sharing, there's very little incentive to do better than compliance. And so it's important. But the problem is these caregivers aren't supported in this. They're not it's not something that's incentivized. And so we wanted to do that. And while doing this, we were also thinking, right now we have a chat-based interface, but how can we do sense making beyond chat? Because this is not necessarily the best way to do this. How can we provide support that's more nuanced?
30 minutes.
Okay, so we did iterative prototyping, and I'm going to run a little bit faster over this. But basically, we developed an interface that merges both the UI for caregivers and the UI for family members. There's privacy and controls embedded in the system that will prevent all the information from showing up for family members. Happy to talk about that more. But basically, family members start with getting these pings for reels. Well, they'll get these it's based on the idea of Instagram reels, but they'll get these 30-second clips that are meaningful moments that are happening. And this is all distilled from a story. So it's the actual clips that generated the stories with a description of what's happening below. And those are what gets sent because they can act as small updates that offer a hook to go in for more information when you need it. And similarly, for caregivers, what they really wanted was just like the missing context in the most digestible form possible. So bullet points. And so we have this essential view that gives them bullet points to track what they need to know when they're about to see someone who they might not be familiar with. But in both of these cases, if the information provokes questions or they have more concerns, the family members or the caregivers can drill down into explanations view, which is what we talked about in our Care Insights paper. It's just basically a chat where you can have this conversation. You see feedback with citations and links to the meaningful moments underneath the hood. So this is sort of the more information on demand, more dynamic, conversational. And then finally, for folks who want to see at the lowest level, what's happening in terms of at the session level, what happened in this session, we have these deep dives and archives view where you can see a timeline of all the meaningful moments in a particular session, highlights of what's going on in that session, overviews that we've generated, and then this is the highlighted engagement scores on top of the transcripts. So just different ways to index into the videos. Because what we learned early on was it's great that people are recording these videos, but nobody's going to watch them. They want to know where they have to look, and they want to be able to click into that directly. So that's what you can do. All these things are clickable, and they take you to moments in the videos. And this is useful for preparing for CARE conferences, and also within Archives View, I'm not going to talk about it here, there's all these controls for managing the flow of information in ways that's acceptable to facilities, including geofencing and other controls. So just the highlights from this, we observed that there was increased visibility and involvement from family members. I just want to share one story. We have so many, but I think this is the most powerful that we observed. There was one CARE recipient who, there was a meaningful moment that was recorded of her where she said, "This therapy gives me a reason to live." And this is someone with advanced dementia. And that was captured, that was shared with the family members. And it's not that this system did provoke that. There's feedback being provided to the caregivers, but we can't take credit for the therapy really. But we can say that this was information that would have never made it to a family member if we didn't have a system that promoted the automated sharing of this. And this person passed away, after the study, and it's just, it's very intense that these types of moments can be generated and stored and shared. And another one, on the other side from caregivers, we saw that this context that's being provided by family members in the form of stories is very important. And I think the best example of this is, there were controversial subjects that should be avoided, and they weren't in the records, so people would just keep doing the same problems over and over again. If we can highlight that, don't talk about this, it reminds her of her abusive ex-husband, that's very important, and caregivers should be seeing that information. So I know we have limited time, so I'm going to quickly jump over to talk briefly about some related work where we look at a similar sort of sense-making dilemma in the education space and use it to draw, to show how there's commonality between this problem for older adults and the problem of students, and what this can tell us about this work more generally. So I wanted to start by just mentioning that I began this journey by being in James Landay's reading group for the Smart Primer, and I think when I started, we were just reading, The Diamond Age, which is a book where there's a young woman who has a book that is an AI tutor, basically, but it's more dynamic. It's physical, it has a presence, and it can do all kinds of cool experiential learning things. And James had some great work on how do we build this in real life. And that's always been an inspiration for me. But another thing that was an inspiration that sort of feeds into all this work is Juho Kim's work on the idea of learner sourcing. And learner sourcing, I think it's important just to read this, is a form of crowdsourcing in which learners collectively contribute novel content for future learners while engaging in a meaningful learning experience themselves. So this is the idea of doing crowdsourcing in the service of building these collective resources that can then feed back and support each individual learner. And every crowdsourcing activity is also a learning activity. It's a very powerful lens to look at this problem of collaboration because it totally flips on its head a lot of the existing literature on AI, where the AI is this tool that's personalizing to a user. It's really how can the AI be in service of helping students collaborate with each other. And I don't have time to get into it here, but there's some great work I can talk about later that looks at some of the problems with AI and how it's being used in education today. And I think this is a potential way to address that. And there's a framework that we're building on top of, which looks at how you ensure that content that's generated through learner sourcing is valid and effective and meaningful. And so tying this all together, my research question for this was, how might we support engaging, collaborative, and context-aware learning experiences at scale? And at the heart of this is this idea of collecting, aggregating, and leveraging the distributed context that each individual student has that together might be able to enable better learning. And So this work was done like all the work I've done. I try and partner with an institution that I think is doing a great job of this already, so I can learn from these experts. I think TUMO is perhaps the best player in this space. They have over 2,000 teams they serve globally. They have these really innovative centers that mesh technology and art. And so I started this work actually before I was even a PhD student by teaching a class at TUMO, first in person, several places in Lebanon and Armenia, and then online. And it's really a reiteration of the Stanford CS 221 course, but geared at high school students. And then with my sister, Sophia, who is amazing and you know, a great person for understanding how stories really work, we extended this idea because we noticed that students really liked my assignment on creating a chatbot. And they, on their own initiative, created these storytelling chatbots. So we thought, what if we connect the idea of learner sourcing with this idea of a storytelling chatbot and create a way for students to tell meaningful stories to one another as teaching experiences. And these can be immersive, they can be based in their unique context, and we can really focus on this idea of enabling peer-to-peer collaboration. So that was what this work did. And we first started with an online-only workshop during COVID, and then we had an in-person workshop that lasted 2 weeks in Yerevan. And during this experience, we were dealing with something that was rather dark because the place where we were, Yerevan, was just basically coming out of and still experiencing really the Nagorno-Karabakh war. And so there was a lot of people with trauma, and the students were dealing with a lot. And so we talked with because this is a small country dealing with a very traumatic experience. And so we talked to the facilitators at this institution, and we said, well, what can we do? Like, how can we be not only a part of teaching, you know, concepts, like in this case, we're teaching AI education, but also be inspiring and motivating the students and giving back joy. And so we started with this idea of, well, if we're going to have stories, why don't the stories be focused on moments of joy that are gathered through semi-structured interviews with people in the community? And this was something that was both inspired by feedback from the participants and also from the administrators. And this really started, I think, a lot of powerful content generation, because initially the stories were kind of, they were just very frail. Like they weren't very interesting or engaging or meaningful. But once students started gathering stories about people in their community, they became powerful. And so we tested that in Yerevan, then we tested that in Berlin to see how these stories work with people from a different community in a context that was different. And then we deployed it online for a week-long deployment study that was more based on this idea of a standard structure for this course if we were to do it more long-term. And I'll talk about those findings in a moment. I'm going to breeze through this, but I thought, you know, we can come back if you have questions. What do these stories actually look like? This is an example of our platform and a particular story where there's someone in a street market who is a familiar face, and then they're trying to maximize their profits in their street market while also, you know, they know that their neighbor is going to try and minimize their profits too. This is our interface. And we had a number of different, we triangulated sort of the user experience through a number of different ways: personal attitude, sense of belonging and computing, readiness to learn. We looked at the literature and, you know, tried to identify what are the meaningful instruments to use here and deployed them through both in situ evaluations and also surveys and knowledge assessments, pre and post. And what we found was that people spent a lot of time on this. During our deployment study alone, there was 674 hours because these stories are really fun and engaging. And the whole thing here is once you get hooked on using the stories, you eventually become a creator. And creation starts with just writing stories, and then it moves into writing code to enact those stories on the platform. And then eventually you actually implement the algorithms themselves and build them in as mini games. And so there's this whole cycle of engagement. And the culturally situated stories are more interesting to the students in Berlin and elsewhere, which we found interesting. Happy to talk about that more. We noticed learning gains across the board, but this was particularly promising for female learners. And we can come back to this. And I just want to close out here on some common themes. We've talked about two very different situations, but what ties these together is that in both cases, I think there's four things. One, we're respecting the constraints of the users. So in the caregiver and the family member situation, there are certain privacy considerations and just attention and attention and time constraints that we have to pay attention to. We can't give feedback that people can't receive. And for the students, we can't expect them to provide all of the information about how they want to be taught. We have to infer this from interactions with other students and from creating desire to teach other people. And so there's really this idea that we're going to not just expect you to give the context to the system and have it feedback a personalized response, but engage with you in a way that creates meaningful results. And then this goes to this idea of, through that, we're creating value in the moment, but also eliciting context that, as with learner sourcing, it's sort of added up into this sort of whole that is providing value as you go. This context accumulates and provides additional value with usage. Third, we're bridging the gaps between users' context. We're not trying to silo people here in either case, even though not all of these situations are what we might typically think of as a community. Like, for instance, students online, it's less clear where the community borders are, but in all these cases, we found ways to bridge context gaps to make use of similarities and also build a sense of interest. And finally, we're leveraging user-generated narratives for sense-making support. And this is really the core of it. Like, the top three things are about how we get to this, but then once we have these narratives, we're able to provide these story-type supports that can accommodate the needs of the user. And I get at this idea of, how do we frame this in a way that's useful for other people? And I really like, the work on agentic AI and how that frames this design orientation. And I think that we can think about what I propose is this idea of stewardship of narratives as a similar type of sensitizing lens, where a steward in this case is one who actively directs affairs. And so I propose in this thesis that the idea of narrative stewardship should encompass this idea of actively directing the collaborative assembly and use of narrative scaffoldings in the sense that they're defined in that paper I talked about in the beginning for sense making. And this is really the purpose of this work. We've examined a couple of different use cases, but there's many more. And so I propose that these three technical artifacts should serve as exemplars for future researchers in this space, and that empirical findings can be useful, and that this is a more generalized lens. And I'd love to explore it in future work in other domains. There's a number of different domains Liz and I have talked about, but just in the works right now, we have this study that looks at how can we provide smart glasses support to be even more sort of embedded in people's workflows in care facilities. And finally, I want to acknowledge just all the people who contributed to this: Liz, my committee, Petra, Lori, James, Liz, the MEMCARA team for all your awesome work and support, the PhD innovation program, my lab mates, especially Songyun, who's provided essential technical support and sat with me for hours of debugging. My parents, sister, Sophia, amazing. Friends, family, thank you all who showed up on the video. And my wife, Melanie, most of all, for sticking this through and being long distance for many years as I did this PhD. And also, I'm very excited, the Companion IQ team. I think you guys are on the call, and we're doing some awesome work on supporting caregiving for older adults and loneliness. So I'll close with that and take questions. Thank you all very much.
Any questions from the general audience on Zoom or person?
I can ask a really general question. What's your favorite part of this journey?
That's a good question. Favorite part of this journey? I think teaching the kids, actually. It's just like, it's not even necessarily innate. It's not like anything that is unique, but I think that I love the experience of teaching, and it was so much fun to teach a class with my sister, who has a very complementary and interesting different set of experiences. Like, she's focused on gender studies and she's focused on narratology, and it's not something where my expertise is on, but to blend those two together and teach kids how to run these interviews in the wild, and then see them bring that back and merge that in with technical peer tutoring basically was super cool. And it felt very innovative, and we had the support of this massive organization, which is kind of like a superpower, So I love that, to do something that I enjoy and have institutional support for it.
Well, I'm sure I and the committee will have many more deep questions. Maybe one to help also warm up the rest of the audience. You had to kind of breeze through the end there with future directions. We got a taste of how these ideas can look in education. Would you like to share some of the other areas where you see these ideas as particularly promising and relevant?
Yeah. So I'll just share one thing that I've been thinking about recently, which is this idea of like supporting, like grouping people to. I have a paper that I submitted actually to a conference and presented on it. It's not covered in this work, but it was this idea of like clustering like-minded individuals so they can pursue their passions and be supported by AI in a way where it can sort of plan ahead for future clusters. So for instance, if Melody's interested in music and, but she's not ready to yet play with people who are at a higher level, it can help her cluster with people who are at her level and then sort of work her way up. And I think it's this idea where we've experienced in the past couple of years just so many tools that are focused on either supporting you as an individual or supporting you matching with one other person. But this idea of dynamically grouping people together and then like supporting that in a project management sense more dynamically and managing that over time, I think it would be really powerful because I know in our lab, there are many people who reach out to me who want to be involved in our work and I don't have bandwidth. But I'd love to match them together so that they can work with these sort of autonomously managed projects in little clusters and then work their way up, gain the skills necessary so they could actually contribute at sort of the Empower Lab level. And then I'd love for myself and other people to be doing the same thing for the professional sphere so that we are also getting matched in ways that like, we're ultimately getting looped in with Apple or whatever. And like, I think there can be this more thoughtful, personalized attention to an individual's unique journey in a lifelong learning way that we're not seeing. And so it's still in the education space, but it could span, many different facets of a person's life.
Lawrence has a question on the chat.
Oh, would you be able to read the question?
Yeah.
Does hospice care have a, thank you, Uncle Larry, for the question. Does hospice care have an important place in this? Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'll just say that like, we were focused in this work on care facilities, and I know a lot of hospice care happens at home. And so I think hospice care definitely does, but just more generally, the idea that we need better support tools for family caregivers than we have right now. And like, I think that really obvious, maybe to Liz's point, like really obvious next step for a lot of this work is how do you also provide better support to family members? And the needs are a little different there. You're not dealing with this like distributed context, but you are dealing with, a situation where you want to be able to support the same types of activities and take the burden off of family members. And so maybe automating some aspects of this memory care program, maybe recognizing, through sort of the similar types of perceptive capabilities that we developed in our training to be able to recognize problems and recognize things that you'd like to do more of. I hope that answers your question.
Well, I see that we are at an hour from when we started, so we don't have any other questions from the general audience. We can move into the private portion with just the committee. So any other final questions? Yes, if not, thank you so much, Dylan.
And I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who showed up on the Zoom. I really appreciate it. And you guys, I see you all there. You've all stuck with me through this. And I know Steve, we were chatting about this on long walks, and I am, I'm just really happy to have you guys all along for the journey. Your support means the world to me. Great. Well, thank you. I guess I'll.
Thanks.
turn off the, should I turn off the record?
Yeah, we'll turn off the recording. We'll make sure that,
And the camera.
everyone
will be-
accepts.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we'll make sure everybody accepts Jane's